Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is a persistent claim that circulates among readers of cosmic horror, one that sounds almost heretical when stated plainly. Lovecraftian monsters possess a weakness, and it is not noble, grand, or hard-won. It is small, it is incidental, and in some cases, it is embarrassingly human. This idea refuses to go away because the texts themselves refuse to fully deny it. Again and again, entities described as eternal, godlike, and beyond matter are interrupted, delayed, or momentarily repelled by circumstances that feel beneath them. That contradiction should trouble us. Cosmic horror is supposed to erase the possibility of leverage. It dismantles the notion that power can be opposed or that knowledge can be weaponized. And yet the stories leave behind traces of resistance, collapsed rituals, interrupted awakenings, survivable encounters. These are not climaxes, they are fractures. They suggest something unresolved at the core of the genre. We will not treat these moments as plot conveniences or authorial mistakes. Instead, we will examine what they reveal about fear, narrative necessity, and the limits of human comprehension. This is not an argument about how to defeat cosmic entities. It is an inquiry into why weakness appears at all in a universe designed to exclude it. With that question in mind, we can now begin at the only place that makes sense: the historical and philosophical conditions that made cosmic horror possible in the first place. To grasp the notion of weakness in Lovecraftian entities, we must first consider the time and mind from which they emerged. H.P. Lovecraft wrote in the early 20th century, during a period shaped by rapid scientific upheaval and civilizational decline. The First World War had shattered Enlightenment faith in human progress. Quantum physics and astronomy were revealing a universe that was not only vast, but irrational. These forces converged in Lovecraft's psyche, already predisposed to philosophical pessimism and a deep fear of cultural entropy. He did not aim to frighten in the traditional sense. He sought to disorient. Lovecraft's letters reveal a man committed to what he called cosmic indifferentism, the belief that the universe operates without regard to human concerns. In this light, the so-called weaknesses of his monsters take on a new dimension. They are not Achilles' heels, but narrative concessions, brief illusions of coherence in an otherwise senseless void. Lovecraft once wrote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Yet even here, the phrase misleads. His horror was not about the unknown becoming known, but the known becoming unrecognizable. We must pause here to consider what counts as defeat in a Lovecraftian story. These tales rarely offer resolution. Instead, they end in collapse of sanity, of perception, of narrative reliability. When Cthulhu is driven back by the ramming of a ship, it is not a triumph. It is a fluke. The narrator survives not by courage, but by accident. This is not victory. It is anecdote, and one that Lovecraft frames with cautionary distance. Lovecraft's monsters emerge from a literary lineage more aligned with philosophical allegory than Gothic horror. They are heirs to Poe's abstraction, Machen's mystical dread, and Bierce's epistemic instability. Unlike Dracula or Frankenstein's creature, they are not failed products of human hubris, but signals from beyond the veil of human relevance. When a character glimpses an old one, the narrative structure itself often ruptures. Perspective warps, language fails. What seems like a weakness, say a retreating god, is usually a recalibration of the reader's assumptions, This inversion becomes clearer when we examine Lovecraft's structural patterns. Many of his stories begin with rational inquiry. A scholar, a journalist, a curious outsider. The plot proceeds as accumulation of artifacts, testimonies, dreams, until a boundary is crossed. At that moment, the story does not climax. It implodes. If there is a weakness to the monster, it functions not as resolution, but as a symbolic misreading. A human constructs the idea of victory in order to survive the trauma of incomprehension. Consider this carefully. What we interpret as weakness may, in the cosmic horror tradition, be a mirror. The monster appears repelled not because it was vulnerable, but because the narrative could not continue otherwise. This is a vital distinction. In most horror, the monster's flaw defines the arc. In Lovecraft, the flaw often defines the narrator. Lovecraft's creative intent was not to terrify with creatures, but to suggest a reality where creatures do not matter. His focus was ontological. The old ones do not hunt us. They do not even notice us. Mediceo. Pathetic weakness, then, lies in our need to impose a structure, our compulsion to map cause and effect, action and consequence, victory and defeat, onto a universe that refuses such patterns. This framework establishes the stakes for our investigation. We are not asking why Cthulhu can be struck. We are asking why we ever believed he could be. And from that, we transition to the deeper roots, the cultural and philosophical structures that made such beliefs necessary in the first place. Next, we turn to those antecedents, not to trace lineage, but to understand how older worldviews, mythic, Gnostic, theological, shaped the scaffolding into which Lovecraft poured his unspeakable forms. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror in a vacuum. He inherited a cultural landscape already fractured by the collapse of older explanatory systems. By the late 19th century, Western thought had begun to internalize a destabilizing realization. The universe no longer required humanity to explain itself. Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 displaced divine intentionality with blind process. Astronomy, following figures like Herschel and Laplace, expanded the cosmos beyond any scale compatible with human centrality. These developments did not simply add knowledge, they removed reassurance. Cosmic horror emerges precisely from this absence. Earlier mythological systems had already grappled with inhuman divinity, but they did so within frameworks that preserved meaning. Ancient Near Eastern chaos myths, Tiamat, Apep, Typhon, portrayed primordial forces as hostile yet conquerable. Order ultimately prevailed. Even when gods were monstrous, they were legible. Greek mythology allowed the Olympians to be cruel, arbitrary, and vast, yet they remained narratively bounded. They could be deceived, wounded, replaced. Their weaknesses reinforced human relevance. Lovecraft's innovation was to remove that reassurance entirely. We must pause here to consider Gnosticism and an often overlooked antecedent. Gnostic cosmology proposed a universe ruled not by a benevolent creator, but by an ignorant or hostile demiurge. Humanity's suffering stemmed from existing within a flawed cosmic system. This worldview shares with Lovecraft a suspicion toward creation itself. However, Gnosticism preserved an escape. Secret knowledge offered salvation. Lovecraft strips even this away. His forbidden knowledge does not liberate, it corrodes. Where the Gnostic initiate ascends, the Lovecraftian investigator collapses. The Enlightenment intensified this fracture rather than resolving it. Thinkers like Kant acknowledged that reality in itself was inaccessible to human reason. We perceive phenomena, not noumena. This philosophical limit quietly undermined the assumption that the universe was, in principle, understandable. By the 19th century, pessimistic philosophers such as Schopenhauer pushed further, portraying existence as driven by an irrational will indifferent to suffering. Lovecraft absorbed these ideas secondhand, translating them into narrative form. His entities do not act with intention, they persist. That distinction matters. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror is not anti-religious in a simplistic sense. It is post-theological. The horror does not arise from the absence of gods, but from their irrelevance. In older traditions, divine weakness explained human survival. A god could be tricked, appeased, or slain. In Lovecraft, moments that resemble weakness are epistemic artifacts. They arise when human storytelling collides with non-human scale. The weakness exists only because the narrative cannot sustain pure indifference indefinitely. Comparisons to contemporaries clarify this further. Algernon Blackwood's cosmic dread retains a spiritual dimension. The universe is overwhelming, but meaningful. Arthur Machen's horror gestures toward hidden truths behind reality's veil. Lovecraft departs from both. There is no hidden order waiting to be discovered. There is only structure where humans impose it. The appearance of weakness functions as that imposition. It is the mind insisting on pattern under conditions that deny it. Consider also the cultural trauma of industrialization. The early 20th century normalized systems that were vast, impersonal, and lethal. Factories, bureaucracies, mechanized warfare. Individuals survived these systems not through heroism, but through luck, timing, and anonymity. Lovecraft's monsters behave similarly. They do not target protagonists. They engulf environments. Survival appears as exception, not rule. What readers interpret as a flaw in the entity mirrors lived experience within modern systems that dwarf individual agency. It is tempting to say these antecedents explain Lovecraft's pessimism. That would be incomplete. They explain his method. He inherited philosophical frameworks that denied cosmic justice, mythic traditions that once softened divine terror, and a modern world that functioned without moral concern. From these, he constructed entities that embody structural indifference. Any apparent weakness emerges at the fault line between these traditions and the narrative demands of fiction itself. As we move forward, this tension becomes increasingly linguistic. If gods cannot be defeated, they must at least be named. If they cannot be named accurately, their names must feel ancient, alien, and unstable. The next subsection examines how Lovecraft used language itself, etymology, phonetics, and symbolic naming, to manufacture the illusion of comprehension where none truly exists. Lovecraft's monsters cannot be understood, yet they must be named. This paradox, assigning signifiers to the unnameable, sits at the heart of his myth-making. The Old Ones, the Great Race, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth. Each name functions less as a linguistic key than as a boundary marker. It tells the reader where comprehension ends. Language in Lovecraft becomes a sacrificial interface. It attempts to describe the undescribable, and in doing so, collapses into phonetic ritual. The names themselves are constructed to resist analysis. Cthulhu does not obey English phonology. Lovecraft admitted as much. In a 1934 letter, he explained that the proper pronunciation was closer to Cthulhu, a sound unachievable by the human vocal apparatus. This admission is not peripheral, it is structural. By denying pronunciation, Lovecraft denies domestication. The name signals that this entity was not meant to be spoken of, yet has been, incompletely and dangerously. The act of naming becomes a violation, not a clarification. We must pause here to reflect on the symbolic weight of invented language. In traditional occult literature, names confer power. To name a demon is to bind it. In Judeo-Christian mysticism, the ineffable name of God, Tetragrammaton, is both a barrier and a safeguard. Lovecraft inverts this tradition. His names do not provide access. They mock it. They gesture toward meaning without granting control. The reader sees the glyph, but is denied the grammar. Consider the Necronomicon, perhaps the most infamous of Lovecraft's creations. It is not merely a book of forbidden knowledge. It is a linguistic trap. The very act of reading it initiates psychic collapse. The implication is clear. There exists language so potent, so structurally corrosive, that it functions as a cognitive virus. Here, weakness emerges not in the monster, but in the medium through which it is described. Language becomes the fissure through which madness leaks. Triadic listing, a recurrent pattern in Lovecraft's naming, amplifies this effect. Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, and Yog-Sothoth. Each name evokes a different cadence, a different culture of dread. Azathoth suggests atonality and nuclear chaos. Nyarlathotep moves like a whisper or a chant. Yog-Sothoth swells with complexity and implication. These are not merely labels. They are sonic architectures. The ritualistic rhythm of their syllables embeds a kind of phonetic metaphysics into the text. Rhetorically, Lovecraft uses pseudo-translations to destabilize further. Phrases like known to the ancients as, or called in the dread tongue of Leng, imply layers of interpretation without ever providing access. These gestures toward translation serve two purposes. First, they create the illusion of scholarly depth, fragments of a larger, unknowable lexicon. Second, they defer clarity indefinitely. The more one learns, the more the text fragments. The mythos expands precisely because it resists totality. This reveals something profound. The monsters are not weakened by names. They are insulated by them. The names function as semiotic armor, offering the illusion of understanding while ensuring permanent misapprehension. In this light, the pathetic weakness is not Cthulhu's. It is the scholar's. It is the human compulsion to map sound onto distinct reality, to imagine that naming the storm will halt the wind. Even the visual representations of these beings, when attempted, fail under scrutiny. Lovecraft frequently resorts to negation. Creatures are described as not quite like a squid, impossibly geometrical, or suggesting the outlines of wings where none existed. Language is used not to define, but to undefine. The reader is left with absence shaped into prose. Where traditional horror shows the monster, cosmic horror dismantles the act of showing. There is a temptation to treat these naming conventions as mere aesthetics, as stylistic flourishes meant to sound arcane. That would be a mistake. Lovecraft weaponized language. He turned phoneme into symbol, grammar into hallucination. His creatures do not hide behind names. They emerge through them. And what appears to be a handle, something to grasp, is only a glyph cut into the surface of something deeper and unknowable. As we transition into the final section of Part 1, we must consider how these strategies, naming, myth-making, and constructed antiquity, were employed not just to unsettle, but to authenticate. Lovecraft did not merely invent gods. He embedded them in documents, journals, genealogies, and ruins. The illusion of narrative authenticity became the final tool in his project, and it is through that illusion that weakness, however illusory, first takes on the shape of possibility. Lovecraft's most enduring innovation was not any single entity, but the method by which those entities were made to feel historically inevitable. He understood that cosmic horror could not rely on spectacle. It required credibility. To achieve this, he constructed a network of false authorities, books, scholars, ruins, and correspondences that mimicked the apparatus of real historical knowledge. The horror does not emerge from what these sources say, but from the fact that they appear to exist at all. Reality, in Lovecraft's fiction, seems already compromised before the plot begins. The Necronomicon exemplifies this strategy. Presented as an Arabic text translated into Greek and Latin, attributed to a mad Arab, and cited across multiple stories, it functions as a scholarly anchor. Lovecraft provided dates, variant titles, and chains of transmission. He treated the book the way historians treat fragmented classical sources. This detail matters. By embedding the mythos in a pseudo-academic framework, Lovecraft encourages the reader to adopt the habits of research, cross-referencing, verification, inference. The moment these habits are engaged, the reader is already implicated. We must pause here to examine the role of documentation. Lovecraft's stories frequently rely on journals, police reports, archaeological findings, and academic lectures. These are genres associated with objectivity. Their presence suggests that the events described have been filtered, moderated, and sanitized. Yet they consistently fail. Documents trail off. Witnesses die. Records contradict one another. This is not accidental. The collapse of documentation mirrors the collapse of epistemic trust. Knowledge systems strain under the weight of what they attempt to contain. This approach draws from earlier literary traditions, but sharpens them. Gothic fiction used found manuscripts to lend verisimilitude. Lovecraft repurposes this device to erode certainty rather than establish it. The more sources accumulate, the less stable the narrative becomes. Authenticity multiplies confusion. What appears to be a weakness, fragmentation, inconsistency, incomplete data, is in fact the engine of dread. The truth cannot be assembled because it was never whole. Collaborative myth-building further reinforced this effect. Lovecraft encouraged peers such as Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard to reference shared texts and entities. This was not casual homage. It created the illusion of an external mythology larger than any single author. The mythos began to resemble a genuine cultural residue rather than a fictional invention. Readers encountering repeated references across different stories experienced a sense of discovery rather than consumption. The horror felt inherited, not authored. Here the idea of weakness reappears in a subtle form. When myths spread, they mutate. Later writers and readers attempt to systematize what was never designed to be stable. Apparent rules emerge. Apparent limits appear. This is not because the entities possess constraints, but because mythology, as a human process, demands structure. Not chaos, but pattern. Not indifference, but causality. The moment an entity is treated as part of a system, it acquires the illusion of vulnerability. This reveals the final tension of Lovecraft's method. His myth-building techniques invite belief while sabotaging comprehension. The reader feels there must be a key somewhere, a missing page, a suppressed translation, a lost ritual. That feeling is the trap. Narrative authenticity creates the expectation of mastery. Cosmic horror exists to deny it. What looks like a weakness in the gods is actually a weakness in myth itself. It cannot sustain absolute meaninglessness. As we move into part 2, this tension shifts from structure to substance. We leave behind the scaffolding of history and language and confront the ideas themselves. Insignificance, entropy, and fractured reality. If weakness exists in the Lovecraftian cosmos, it will not be found in flesh or form, but in the philosophical pressure points where human meaning-making finally gives way. At the foundation of cosmic horror lies a simple, unbearable proposition. We do not matter. Not individually, not collectively, not even as a species. This is not merely existential pessimism, it is ontological displacement. The universe, in Lovecraft's fiction, operates on scales so vast and logics so foreign that human relevance dissolves. Consider the Whisperer in Darkness, where alien beings traverse space and time with such ease that human civilization is reduced to folklore. The horror is not invasion, but indifference. The Mygo do not conquer, they harvest. Humanity is not an adversary, but a mineral. This is the first axis, insignificance. It is often misunderstood as nihilism. But Lovecraft does not propose that nothing matters. He proposes that we do not. The cosmos is not empty, but full, teeming, saturated with entities, forces, and geometries that predate consciousness and will outlast matter. The fear emerges not from being alone, but from being irrelevant in company. The old ones do not punish humans, they overlook them. And when they are noticed, it is always by mistake. The second axis is entropy, not as thermodynamic law, but as symbolic principle. Systems decay, forms collapse, meaning erodes. Lovecraft returns obsessively to ruins, to ancestral mansions crumbling under their own weight, to degenerate bloodlines and forgotten cities. The rats in the walls, the shadow out of time, and the nameless city all depict human attempts to anchor history within a framework of coherence, only to reveal that civilization is a thin crust over geologic and psychic abysses. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, he writes, and with strange aeons, even death may die. The phrase appears to offer hope. It doesn't. It erases even death as a boundary. Entropy becomes metaphysical, not disorder, but recycling without closure. We must pause here to consider dream reality, the third axis. Lovecraft was fascinated by the porous boundary between waking consciousness and dream space. Stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Statement of Randolph Carter suggest that reality is contingent, fragile, permeable, possibly hallucinatory. Dreams in Lovecraft are not wish fulfillment. They are revelations. In The Call of Cthulhu, it is through dreams that artists and sensitives receive glimpses of the submerged God. These dreams do not come from within. They are transmissions. The implication is staggering. If dreams are not private, then thought itself is vulnerable. This tripartite structure, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, dislocates the self on every level. Spatially, we are irrelevant. Temporally, we are decaying. Cognitively, we are unmoored. What appears to be weakness in the monsters may, in this light, be projection. When Cthulhu retreats, perhaps it is not a loss. Perhaps it is a correction. A dream receding into the unconscious. A veil closing after being lifted too long. The entity has not been diminished. It has been momentarily misaligned with our frame of perception. Lovecraft's narratives encode these concepts formally. Protagonists begin as rationalists. They investigate, measure, translate. The horror begins not when they discover something unnatural, but when their tools stop working. In The Color Out of Space, scientific language fails to describe a phenomenon that is visible yet unnameable. The color cannot be classified because it does not belong to the spectrum. It is a sense-breaking encounter. Defeat in these stories is not physical, it is epistemic. The mind cannot reconcile what it sees with what it knows, and so it fractures. This reveals something profound. In cosmic horror, weakness is a human metaphor applied to non-human entities. To say that a god has been repelled is to assume it was present in a way we could affect. But presence, like perception, is conditional. If Yog-Sothoth exists outside time, what does it mean to interrupt its appearance? If Azathoth is blind chaos, what does it mean to survive its dance? These are not questions with answers. They are questions that expose the futility of asking. And yet, we continue to ask. We narrate. We interpret. We assign weakness not because it exists, but because it comforts. Cosmic horror refuses that comfort. It invites us to imagine a world where our categories, victory, defeat, power, knowledge, no longer apply. In that world, monsters do not have weaknesses. They have ontological dissonance. They appear broken only because we tried to parse them through a human lens. From here, the investigation turns to those very entities, not in search of taxonomy, but to explore how they resist structure. If the concepts discussed here displace humanity, the beings they describe obliterate it. Let us now examine the entities themselves, not to define them, but to see how definition fails in their presence. Lovecraft's entities are often described as monsters, but this term obscures their function. They are not adversaries within a moral or narrative system. They are ontological disturbances, expressions of realities that do not intersect cleanly with human categories. The old ones, the great old ones, the outer gods. These are not ranks in a hierarchy so much as failed attempts at classification. Lovecraft supplies names because narrative requires reference points, not because the entities themselves are discrete or stable. Consider Cthulhu, introduced in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. Popular culture treats him as a slumbering god who can be awakened or thwarted. The text suggests something stranger. Cthulhu is described as a mountain walked or stumbled, an entity whose form resists cohesion. When the sailors encounter him, physical interaction produces not injury, but distortion. The ship passes through him as a needle through jelly. This is not resilience. It is incompatibility. What looks like survival is merely a brief overlap between dimensions that were never meant to touch. We must pause here to examine Yog-Sothoth, often rendered as omniscient and omnipresent. In the Dunwich Horror, Yog-Sothoth is invoked as a gateway rather than a being. Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the text insists, and Yog-Sothoth is the key. This triadic formulation, entity, threshold, mechanism, collapses, distinction. Yog-Sothoth cannot be confronted because it is not localized. There is no center to strike. Any apparent failure of its manifestation reflects ritual inadequacy, not divine limitation. The force remains intact, indifferent to the attempt. Nyarlathotep complicates matters further. Unlike other entities, he interacts. He speaks. He wears faces. This has led to the mistaken belief that he is more vulnerable, more human, perhaps even defeatable. The stories suggest the opposite. Nyarlathotep's power lies in mediation. He translates cosmic indifference into human-scale catastrophe. His adaptability is not a weakness, but a strategy. Where other gods remain remote, Nyarlathotep ensures suffering is intelligible. That intelligibility invites resistance, and resistance in turn fuels despair. Dreamland's beings introduce another layer of confusion. Entities encountered in dreams appear mutable, even fragile. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, God's bargain, retreat, and mislead. This seems to contradict cosmic invulnerability. It does not. The dreamlands operate under different ontological rules. They are not less real, but differently real. Their instability reflects the instability of perception itself. When a dream god yields, it does not lose power. The dreamer simply awakens. Outer gods, such as Azathoth, represent the terminus of this logic. Azathoth does not rule. It churns. Described as a blind idiot god, it exists at the center of chaos, surrounded by piping demons. This imagery tempts allegory. We must resist it. Azathoth's blindness is not a flaw. It is the absence of intention altogether. There is nothing to exploit, nothing to negotiate with, nothing to defeat. The universe persists not because it is maintained, but because it has not yet collapsed into noise. This reveals a consistent pattern. Whenever an entity appears to fail, the failure occurs at the interface between cosmic scale and human narrative. Doors close. Rituals. Misfire. Manifestations dissipate. These events are not defeats. They are alignment errors. The entities remain what they always were. Only the conditions of encounter change. Weakness, in this context, is a misreading produced by proximity. Comparisons to traditional mythology sharpen this distinction. When Zeus is wounded or Odin sacrifices an eye, the loss carries symbolic meaning. It reinforces moral order. Lovecraft's entities suffer no such losses. Nothing is learned. Nothing is corrected. Apparent vulnerability yields no transformation. The cosmos does not respond. It continues. As we move forward, the focus must shift from the entities themselves to those who encounter them. If the gods do not break, something else does. The next section examines how human minds absorb these encounters, and why madness, not death, becomes the primary narrative consequence of proximity to the cosmic. Lovecraftian horror is not measured in body counts. It is measured in collapses of reason, language, memory, and self. Death may occur, but it is rarely central. The true horror, again and again, is madness. Not theatrical insanity, but epistemic failure. A mind breaking under the weight of incompatible knowledge. The entities do not destroy humans directly. They force humans to confront perspectives they were never evolved to endure. What follows is not conflict. It is dissolution. Madness in Lovecraft's work functions not as a symptom, but as a threshold. In The Call of Cthulhu, the scattered cults, artists, and sensitives who dream of Cthulhu share no contact, yet experience identical visions. Their sanity erodes not through exposure, but through reception. The knowledge arrives uninvited. The dream, once entered, cannot be refused. Resistance is irrelevant. The mind itself becomes permeable. This is not contagion. It is resonance. Consider the unnamed narrator of the nameless city who descends into ruins and emerges transformed. He sees nothing clearly. There is no confrontation. Yet his final words, "I pray to all gods that I may never awaken in the night," signal permanent psychological displacement. The encounter rewrites his inner structure. The entity's weakness, if one insists on the term, lies not in vulnerability, but in its inability to be fully perceived. What damages the mind is not presence, but proximity to partial truth. This reveals something profound. Madness in cosmic horror is a narrative adaptation to the limits of human cognition. Lovecraft repeatedly wrote that true understanding would drive humanity mad. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist absorbs the memories of an alien species, and though he survives physically, he is exiled from ordinary perception. "I cannot speak of it," he writes. I cannot think of it. The horror is not knowledge. It is incommunicable knowledge, a thought with no structure to hold it. The human mind, faced with contradiction, seeks resolution. Cosmic horror denies it. Where? Most horror stories end with catharsis, victory, escape, sacrifice. Lovecraft's narratives often end with stasis. The protagonist knows too much, but cannot act on it. Madness, then, is not an affliction. It is the final state of awareness. It marks the end of narrative movement. Once comprehension fails, so too does plot. This function of madness also explains why so few characters in the mythos stories confront the entities directly. Most accounts come second-hand, from journals, letters, or recovered documents. The act of narration is always distanced, fragmented, delayed. We rarely get the event. We get the aftermath. This structure reinforces the idea that direct encounter is impossible, and if impossible, then survivable only through fracture. The fragmented story mirrors the fragmented mind. Triadic listing often marks these breakdowns. A character will describe a noise, a shape, a sensation. None alone conveys the horror, but together they suggest something just beyond comprehension. In Dagon, the narrator describes the creature as loathsome, repellent, and indescribable. The repetition is not filler, it is function. When description fails, enumeration takes its place. The reader is forced to imagine what the words cannot unify. We must also note how Lovecraft inverts the traditional arc of forbidden knowledge. In classic tragic narratives, forbidden knowledge leads to punishment, but not without dignity. In cosmic horror, there is no transgression, no justice, no lesson. The knowledge arrives unbidden. The investigator is not punished for seeking, but for existing within reach of the signal. The mind breaks not because it errs, but because it is inadequate. From here, the logic becomes inevitable. If madness is the only possible consequence of understanding, then knowledge itself becomes toxic. The final subsection of this part turns to that very toxicity, not as metaphor, but as philosophical collapse. What does it mean to possess knowledge that cannot be used, transmitted, or believed? What remains when comprehension is indistinguishable from annihilation? Let us now examine the function and failure of forbidden knowledge in the cosmic horror tradition. Cosmic horror does not merely suggest that some knowledge is dangerous. It asserts that all knowledge beyond a certain threshold is fundamentally corrosive. In Lovecraft's work, the pursuit of understanding does not illuminate, it infects. Characters do not die because they learn too much. They die because what they learn undoes their capacity to think. The terror is not in what is known, but in what knowledge does to the knower. The term forbidden knowledge appears often in discussions of the genre, but it must be clarified. In religious or mythic traditions, forbidden knowledge implies a gate kept closed by a moral law. Transgress it, and punishment follows. Lovecraft's model is different. There is no law, only limitation. The gate is not guarded. It simply should not be opened because the structure of the human mind cannot support what lies beyond. This is not sin. It is structural failure. In the Dunwich Horror, the Necronomicon serves as a focal point of this logic. Its contents are not evil in a traditional sense. They are destabilizing. Reading it does not grant power. It fractures perception. Consider the note that its author, Abdul al-Hazred, was seized by an invisible monster in broad daylight. The implication is chilling. Understanding does not require summoning. Proximity alone is enough. Thought itself becomes the summoning act. we must pause here to emphasize the epistemological stakes. Cosmic horror is not anti-knowledge, it is post-knowledge. It dramatizes the moment when traditional epistemology collapses. Sensory input, rational inference, empirical observation, all fail. The horror arises when language continues to function, even as meaning degrades. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist experiences an alien past through memory transfer, but cannot communicate what he has seen. He writes, "The things I learned make me afraid. Afraid not because they are violent, but because they exist without interpretability. Forbidden knowledge does not merely lie beyond our reach. It acts on those who glimpse it. It is performative. This is why, in many Lovecraft stories, the process of learning cannot be reversed. Once a perception is formed, once a geometry is seen that should not exist, once a god's name is heard in a dream, it cannot be forgotten." The color out of space illustrates this perfectly. A meteorite infects the soil, the water, the people, not through radiation, but through presence. The scientist who investigates it finds no explanation. He reports, then flees. This reveals something profound. In cosmic horror, knowledge is not power. It is infection, not metaphorically, but formally. The structure of the stories imitates cognitive breakdown. Sentences, fragment, time loops, diaries contradict one another. There is no climactic reveal, only accumulation, then collapse. This structure mirrors the failure of interpretation. The reader is not given the monster. They are given the impossibility of understanding the monster. Rhetorical questions punctuate this collapse. What if the things he saw were real? How many others have dreamt the same shapes? These are not invitations to curiosity. They are warnings. Inquiry does not clarify. It enlarges the circumference of dread. The scholar, the archaeologist, the dreamer, each is a stand-in for the reader. Each is punished not for breaking rules, but for asking questions that reality cannot support. And so, we reach the final implication. The weakness observed in Lovecraftian monsters, their apparent retreat, their interrupted arrival, their symbolic containment, may be nothing more than misread artifacts of cognitive failure. The ritual did not banish the god. The survivor did not defeat it. Rather, the narrative broke down before the horror could fully arrive. The collapse of knowledge becomes the only available defense, not resistance, but fragmentation. As we move into Part 3, we trace this epistemic tension through the literature itself. Where did these ideas first emerge on the page? How were they sustained across stories? And how did specific texts encode, subvert, or exploit the illusion of cosmic vulnerability? It is time to examine the literary architecture, how these ideas were first rendered, and how the stories themselves struggle to hold them. The seeds of cosmic horror's false weaknesses appear early in Lovecraft's canon, not as central motifs, but as byproducts of narrative necessity. His earliest stories, still steeped in Poe and Machen, flirt with the supernatural while groping toward the inexpressible. Yet even in these formative works, we observe a pattern. Human contact with alien forces yields not victory, but damage misread as triumph. This misreading becomes a recurring structural device. Take Dagon, 1919, often cited as the first true Lovecraftian tale. The unnamed narrator, a traumatized WWI veteran, recounts his discovery of a monolithic sea idol in a newly risen portion of the Pacific. The creature he glimpses, loathsome beyond comparison, rises, then disappears. The man survives, but But what readers often miss is the mechanism of survival. The man flees in a morphine haze. His escape is not resistance. It is withdrawal. His final line, "I shall cast myself from this garret window when I cannot write any more," signals that survival was not a reprieve, but a delay. Dagon was not repelled. It simply passed by. The Nameless City, 1921, further develops this structure. A lone archaeologist explores ancient ruins in the Arabian desert, uncovering frescoes of reptilian prehumans. As he descends deeper, he experiences a sensory inversion. Hot becomes cold, up becomes down. He hears a sound. It was the infernal tramping of the saurians, the beings of 1,000 years ago, returning. Yet he is not killed. He escapes, or so he believes. The closing lines convey dread, not safety. Again, there is no confrontation. The horror is spatial and psychological, not violent. What appears to be a narrow escape is never confirmed. It may be a delusion. It may be a story told by someone already changed. Crucially, these early works establish encounter without resolution as the genre's defining move. There is no monster to kill, no spell to reverse the damage. The narrator survives by accident, and the reader is left in limbo. But these ambiguous encounters become more complex as Lovecraft begins to build intertextual connections, introducing shared names, locations, and books. The mythos takes shape not as a consistent universe, but as an expanding mosaic of partial glimpses. The Festival, 1925, exemplifies this shift. A man travels to Kingsport for a traditional Yuletide celebration. He is greeted by silent, corpse-like figures and led through catacombs to witness a ritual involving the Necronomicon. The procession culminates in a vision, something vast and roaring beneath the earth. The narrator flees, hurling himself from a window. He awakens in a hospital, told there was no such gathering. Yet on the final page, he reads that the Necronomicon was found in the dreams of the mad Arab. What saved him? The fall? The shock? Nothing is clear. But again, the entity remains untouched. The ritual is not stopped. The horror proceeds, indifferent. These early stories also begin to cross-reference one another. The Nameless City mentions the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred, before the Necronomicon is formally introduced. The festival names that text outright. Dagon anticipates the cults that will later surface in the Call of Cthulhu. This recursive layering creates an illusion of systematization. But the system is anti-coherent. Each appearance is fragmentary. Each reference deepens confusion rather than resolving it. This reveals something subtle. The illusion of monster weakness often emerges when readers impose coherence on these fragments. If entity A disappears when confronted, and entity B is sealed beneath a church, and entity C retreats after a ritual, then surely they can all be repelled. But the stories never confirm this. In fact, they frequently contradict it. What appears to be resistance is often timing, misinterpretation, or dream logic. The beings are not harmed. They are simply elsewhere. One final example, The Outsider, 1921, though not overtly cosmic, presents the archetype of self as horror. A creature ascends from subterranean exile and approaches human society, only to be met with terror. In the final lines, the narrator glimpses a mirror and sees the monster himself. This structure anticipates later mythos tales in which the monster and the self are entangled. It is not that the being was vulnerable. It is that the narrator could no longer distinguish his mind from what it had encountered. The next two subsections examine case studies where this logic is pushed further. In the Call of Cthulhu, we see the illusion of a monster defeated. In the Dunwich Horror, we see cosmic power framed within human language. But in both cases, what appears to be weakness is always narrative misalignment. The reader sees a break. The horror remains intact. The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, is often cited as the definitive example of a Lovecraftian monster being defeated. This reading persists because the story contains an event that resembles a conventional climax. A god rises, is confronted, and is physically struck. The problem is that this interpretation relies on narrative habits the story itself systematically undermines. What appears to be a moment of weakness is, on closer inspection, a failure of scale and perception. The structure of the tale is instructive. The narrative unfolds through documents, notes, reports, newspaper clippings, compiled after the fact. There is no continuous witness. This fragmentation matters. By the time we reach the account of the Norwegian sailor Gustav Johansen, the event has already been mediated, translated, and filtered. The rising of Cthulhu is not presented directly, it is reconstructed. The reader never encounters the god. Only the residue of encounter survives. Johansen's description resists coherence. He writes of great cyclopean blocks and non-Euclidean geometry, emphasizing that the architecture itself defies human spatial logic. When Cthulhu emerges, it is not described anatomically, but impressionistically. A mountain walked or stumbled. This phrasing is precise. Mountains do not walk. The verb fails. The sentence signals the collapse of reference. The god is not misdescribed. It is indescribable. From the outset, the encounter occurs outside the grammar of confrontation. The infamous moment follows. Johansen, fleeing in panic, rams his ship into the creature. Popular retellings freeze here, transforming accident into heroism. The text does not support this. The collision does not wound Cthulhu. It produces a grotesque visual distortion. The thing of nightmares sprawled out on the water like a green, sticky substance. The simile matters. Cthulhu does not bleed. He loses cohesion. The ship passes through him, as a needle through jelly. This is not vulnerability. It is ontological mismatch. Matter and non-matter intersect briefly, then separate. Immediately afterward, Cthulhu reforms. There is no struggle, no reaction. The sailors flee not because they have won, but because their minds are failing. One by one, they die. Some in pursuit, others by suicide, others under mysterious circumstances later. Johansen himself survives only long enough to write his account. He dies quietly, under suspicious conditions, before the narrative frame closes. Survival, again, is temporary. Knowledge proves fatal. We must pause here to address the role of timing. The text repeatedly emphasizes that the stars were not right. Cthulhu's rising is premature. His retreat is not caused by damage, but by cosmic misalignment. The cultists wait for aeons because they understand this. When the stars were right, the text insists, they could call him from his house. The implication is clear. Conditions govern manifestation, not resistance. The god does not lose. The window closes. This detail is often overlooked because it undermines the satisfaction of conflict, but it aligns perfectly with cosmic horror's logic. The sailor does not banish a god. He survives an accident of timing. The difference is essential. Weakness implies susceptibility. What we observe instead is indifference to human action. Cthulhu retreats not because he was struck, but because the conditions that allowed overlap no longer obtain. The narrative frame reinforces this reading. The unnamed compiler concludes the story by destroying the collected documents. He does not seek to warn the world. he seeks oblivion. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, he admits, fearing that synthesis itself is dangerous. The story ends not with relief, but with anticipation. Cthulhu sleeps again. The cults persist. The stars will realign. Nothing has been solved. This case study establishes a template that will recur throughout the mythos. Apparent defeat masks cosmic continuity. Human action coincides with retreat, creating the illusion of agency. But the text consistently denies causality. The god is not beaten. The narrative simply cannot sustain the encounter longer without dissolving entirely. As we move to the next case study, this pattern intensifies. The Dunwich horror introduces a more elaborate human intervention: ritual, scholarship, and technology. The question is not whether the monster is stopped, but whether stopping was ever the point. If the Call of Cthulhu presents the illusion of physical resistance, the Dunwich horror, 1929, offers something more seductive: the appearance of successful intervention. Here, scholars act. Rituals are performed. A threat seems neutralized. For many readers, this story represents the clearest example of Lovecraft allowing humanity to win. That impression does not survive careful examination. The narrative centers on Wilbur Whately and his grandfather, custodians of forbidden knowledge in the decaying Massachusetts village of Dunwich. Their project is explicit. They seek to open the way for Yog-Sothoth and allow something vast to enter our world. The horror that results, Wilbur's monstrous twin, is not a summoned god, but an incomplete manifestation. It is important to note this distinction. The creature rampaging through Dunwich is not Yog-Sothoth. It is an accident, a biological error produced by partial access to something fundamentally non-biological. When the invisible horror is finally confronted, it is not through violence, but through perception. Dr. Armitage and his colleagues use a powder to render the creature visible and recite a banishing formula derived from the Necronomicon. On the surface, this resembles a classic exorcism. The monster recoils. The village is saved. But Lovecraft undermines this reading immediately. As the creature becomes visible, Armitage does not describe it as an enemy. He describes it as a child, lost, malformed, and abandoned. We must pause here, because this moment reframes the entire event. The creature's final cry, "Father, Father, Yog-Sothoth," is not a curse or a threat. It is a plea. The being does not understand its own existence. It is not defeated. It is terminated, removed because it cannot survive in human reality. This is not triumph over a god. It is the disposal of an error created by human meddling. Crucially, Yog-Sothoth remains untouched. Armitage himself admits this. In his closing speech, he explains that the ritual did not banish the entity, but closed a gate. Yog-Sothoth is still outside, he warns, and there are things where he is that we can never face. The language is precise. The threat has not been neutralized. Access has been temporarily denied. The distinction mirrors the timing logic seen in the Call of Cthulhu. Conditions change. The cosmos does not. The apparent weakness, then, lies not in the cosmic entity, but in manifestation itself. Partial revelation produces instability. The invisible horror fails not because it is vulnerable, but because it is incomplete. It cannot exist fully within our dimensional constraints. Its destruction tells us nothing about the power it originates from. It tells us only that translation across ontological boundaries produces failure. Lovecraft reinforces this by shifting the locus of horror away from spectacle and toward knowledge. Armitage's final monologue is not reassuring. it is apocalyptic. He speaks of spheres and planes where matter and life are unknown, of beings that cut through dimensions as we cut through air. This is not exposition. It is a warning. The scholars have not gained control. They have learned enough to understand how powerless they are. The contrast with traditional horror is stark. In Gothic fiction, defeating the monster restores order. In the Dunwich horror, order is revealed as temporary and artificial. The village returns to silence, but the knowledge remains. Armitage survives, but he is burdened with awareness. The cost of intervention is permanent cognitive displacement. He knows what waits beyond the veil, and he knows it cannot be stopped, only postponed. This case study refines the concept introduced earlier. Weakness in Lovecraftian horror appears only at the margins of manifestation. The closer the entity comes to full presence, the less intelligible resistance becomes. The monster that can be stopped is not the real threat. It is a shadow cast by something larger that remains entirely unaffected. With this framework in place, we can now examine how later writers responded to this ambiguity. Some preserved it. Others attempted to resolve it. In doing so, they transformed cosmic indifference into systems of power, hierarchy, and weakness. The next subsection traces those transformations and the cost of making the unknowable manageable. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos did not fade. It metastasized, adopted, expanded, and reshaped by a network of collaborators and successors. Chief among them was August Derleth, who played a critical role in preserving Lovecraft's legacy through Arkham House. Yet in doing so, Derleth introduced a conceptual reconfiguration that fundamentally altered the cosmic horror blueprint. He gave the gods weaknesses. This shift, though subtle at first, marked a profound divergence from Lovecraft's original vision. Derleth, a devout Catholic, interpreted the mythos through a moral lens. He proposed a binary structure, the elder gods representing good and order versus the great old ones, aligned with chaos and evil. This imposed a Manichaean framework upon a universe Lovecraft had meticulously emptied of such distinctions. More critically, Derleth assigned elemental affiliations and weaknesses. Cthulhu became a water being, vulnerable to fire. Ithaqua, tied to air, could be banished by earth. These ideas do not emerge from Lovecraft's texts. They are retrofits, designed to align incomprehensible forces with traditional narrative tropes. We must pause here to assess the implications. By systematizing the mythos, Derleth reintroduced the illusion of mastery. If the gods can be classified, they can be countered. If they have opposites, they can be balanced. This transformation does not deepen the horror, it domesticates it. Weakness, in Derleth's hands, becomes literal. And in becoming literal, it loses its potency. Other writers followed suit. In Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first released in 1981, Lovecraftian entities were given statistics: hit points, armor, magical resistance. Cthulhu could be fought, Yog-Sothoth summoned with a successful dice roll. These mechanics were necessary for gameplay, but they reinforced a damaging illusion that cosmic entities could be engaged within a human framework. The very tools designed to simulate helplessness risked turning gods into bosses. Not all expansions took this route. Ramsey Campbell preserved a sense of psychological disintegration in his adaptations, emphasizing atmosphere and unease over confrontation. Thomas Ligotti went further, rejecting mythic beings altogether in favor of existential horror, stripped of names and rituals. His work channels Lovecraft's mood, not his metaphysics. In these later evolutions, weakness returns to its original function, not as flaw in the monster, but as mirror to the human condition. The internet age brought another mutation, meme-ification. Cthulhu became plush toys, comic relief, political satire. Why vote for the lesser evil? This ironic embrace blunted the mythos, but also expanded its reach. Weakness here became cultural. The gods were no longer terrifying because they were familiar. Lovecraft's project, to render the unknowable plausible, was inverted. The implausible became a punchline. This transformation did not destroy cosmic horror, but it displaced its emotional register. Dread gave way to detachment. This reveals something profound. When readers demand explanation, they manufacture weakness. Collaborative expansions, well-meaning as they were, turned horror into system. Every clarification, every taxonomy, every stat block eroded what Lovecraft had left undefined. The ineffable, once made playable, became predictable. The unknowable, once made moral, became defeatable. The mythos became mythology in the pejorative sense, a fixed pantheon, not a field of epistemic vertigo. And yet, these expansions also serve a paradoxical purpose. They preserve the horror by making it visible. Derleth's elemental gods, Chaosium's rule books, and even the memes, each is a coping mechanism, a defense. They expose how deeply readers need closure, how urgently they graft narrative logic onto a genre that forbids it. The gods are not weaker. We are more desperate to imagine they are. With this in mind, we now shift from literature to culture. How did these figures, once confined to pulp magazines, leak into dreams, rumors, and sightings? How did the mythos become not just a body of stories, but a collective folk epistemology? In Part 4, we examine the afterlife of these ideas, the myths, hoaxes, adaptations, and psychological echoes that allow weakness to persist even when the stories no longer justify it. Despite their fictional origin, Lovecraft's creations have consistently bled into the margins of belief. Urban legends, fabricated accounts, and digital hoaxes have conspired to lend the mythos a curious afterlife, not as a body of stories, but as a folklore system that behaves like a fringe reality. The entities may be imaginary, but they persist precisely because the boundary between fiction and belief has grown permeable. Cosmic horror, once confined to pulp magazines, now thrives in the interstices of internet folklore. A clear example lies in the long-standing rumor of Cthulhu sightings at sea. Since the 1990s, blurry photographs and leaked sonar readings have circulated online, many doctored, some obviously staged. A 2005 viral post featured an alleged National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, report of a massive squid-like presence detected off the South Pacific. The file was fake. But it did not matter. The post ended with an ambiguous phrase. They're not telling us everything. The myth worked because it was unverifiable. Ambiguity sustained belief. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror thrives in non-resolution. Unlike conventional paranormal narratives, hauntings, alien abductions, the mythos does not demand proof. It suggests. It infects through partial glimpses, suggestive fragments, and untraceable references. Reddit threads routinely share dreams, sightings, or strange symbols found etched into rocks or subway walls, often posted without context. These aren't hoaxes designed to deceive. They are participatory rituals, miniature performances of cosmic indifference. We must pause here to consider the role of alternate reality games, ARGs. Projects like The Sun Vanished or the local 58 YouTube channel deliberately mimic the tone and structure of Lovecraftian dread. They offer hints, not answers. They use unreliable narrators, strange geometries, forgotten organizations. What emerges is not a story, but an experience. Players do not solve the mystery, they fall into it. The entities, if present at all, remain undefined. Weakness never surfaces because full confrontation never occurs. The digital age has further blurred lines between myth and metadata. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project that archives anomalous entities, is perhaps the most structurally Lovecraftian of modern myth systems. SCP entries often describe beings that distort space, perception, or cognition. Many cannot be contained, only delayed or misfiled. In this context, containment procedures echo the banishment rituals of Lovecraft's stories. But crucially, these procedures always strain under epistemic failure. The system does not protect. It maintains the illusion of control. A pattern emerges. Containment narratives masquerade as victories over unknowable forces. But they function as camouflage, rituals to shield us from the full implications of contact. Why do these myths persist? The answer lies in the comfort of partial knowledge. Complete clarity is terrifying in a cosmic horror framework. But unresolved explanation offers a manageable substitute. The sighting that turns out to be a hoax is not dismissed. It becomes part of the myth. The discredited NOAA report, the anonymous dream journal, the ARG entry with no conclusion, all reinforce the core message. Something exists beyond the frame of reference, and it does not care to be understood. This leaves us with a paradox. The more cosmic horror is revealed to be fiction, the more it behaves like belief. It lacks the structure of religion, the credibility of science, or the coherence of folklore. And yet it propagates. It attaches itself to ambiguity. It leaves behind sightings that demand no verification. The monsters remain unseen, and therefore unweakened. In the next section, we explore how these entities, once confined to text and rumor, migrated into other media. Films, games, and music now conjure Lovecraftian forces through sound, image, and code. But as we will see, the shift from narrative to experience complicates the question of weakness even further. Because once a god can be rendered in pixels or chords, we must ask, has it become accessible or simply more fragmented? When Lovecraft's ideas migrated into other media, they faced a structural problem. The medium demands form. Film needs image. Games require interaction. Music demands emotional tonality. Yet Lovecraft's monsters were designed to evade all three. His beings resist visual coherence, thwart agency, and reject mood beyond awe or despair. The result is a paradox. To adapt the mythos is to misrepresent it. And in doing so, creators inadvertently impose weakness, not on the entities, but on the aesthetic of the unknowable itself. Film adaptations are a primary case. The Mist, 2007, though not explicitly Lovecraftian, features monsters drawn directly from his template, extra-dimensional, grotesque, and ambiently hostile. Yet once shown, they acquire weight, texture, and scale. The audience can now estimate size, identify traits, speculate on biology. The horror shifts from incomprehensibility to threat. Visibility produces logic. Even The Thing, 1982, another cosmic horror descendant, transforms terror into tension by grounding it in survival mechanics. The unknowable becomes the monster in the room. Horrific, yes, but ultimately beatable, or at least observable. We must pause here to consider the medium's demands. Film compresses time, forces perspective, and rewards resolution. Even ambiguous endings, like in The Endless, 2017, or The Void, 2016, still present entities that act, respond, and, implicitly, operate within cause-effect frameworks. The moment a being can be lured, escaped, or even looked at, the genre drifts from cosmic horror toward existential thriller. The gods remain massive, but now they behave. That is their weakening. Games face a different but related challenge. Bloodborne, 2015, Call of Cthulhu, 2018, and the Eternal Darkness series draw heavily from the mythos. They succeed. Atmospherically, players encounter madness mechanics, forbidden tomes, unspeakable rituals, but gameplay forces confrontation. Players must attack, retreat, upgrade, succeed. A boss, no matter how terrifying, must have hit points, and the very presence of progression, health meters, items, skill trees, restores a sense of mastery. The unknowable becomes navigable. The god becomes a pattern. This reveals something profound. Interaction implies consequence, and consequence implies agency. Even if the game's ending is bleak, the fact that multiple endings exist reintroduces human relevance. Lovecraft's horror works by denying that relevance. By entering a game system, the mythos is reshaped into a logic loop. The horror is not that Yog-Sothoth knows all, but that his attacks can be dodged. This is not a design flaw. It is an unavoidable side effect of interactivity. Music, though less constrained, still faces interpretive drift. Bands like Metallica, The Call of Cthulhu, Electric Wizard, and Nox Arcana borrow mythos elements to evoke atmosphere. The lyrics, instrumentation, and titles often reference dread, ancient gods, or forbidden knowledge. But music, especially metal and dark ambient, translates cosmic horror into emotive energy. That energy may be despairing or furious, but it externalizes the experience. Lovecraft's horror, by contrast, is internal. It paralyzes, it disorients. Music, by giving shape to terror, renders it expressible and thus survivable. Even more telling is how lighthearted adaptation has become common. Board games like Eldritch Horror, Arkham Horror, and Mansions of Madness offer deeply thematic experiences rooted in mythos lore. Yet players assemble relics, defeat avatars, close portals. The old ones are card effects with cooldowns. The illusion of struggle returns. Players win, not often, but meaningfully. Cthulhu becomes a problem to solve, a threat to manage. The unknowable becomes content. Still, this appropriation is not failure. It is a reflection of need. Audiences want proximity to these ideas, but without disintegration. Adaptations offer that controlled contact. Weakness, then, is not a flaw in the mythos. It is a concession to medium. Each frame, chord, and mechanic invites understanding. And understanding is, in cosmic horror, the first symptom of collapse. The next section explores how this transformation of the mythos intersects with subculture and scholarship. If adaptations weakened the gods to make them playable or visible, how have communities, academic, occult, or ironic, repurposed them as symbols? And more provocatively, does that repurposing itself mark the final triumph of the human over the unknowable, or simply the most sophisticated delusion yet? As Lovecraft's mythos diffused through media, it also found new homes in subcultures, ideologies, and academic frameworks. These communities did not merely adopt his creations, they repurposed them. The result is a proliferation of meanings, many of which invert the original function of cosmic horror. The old ones are no longer just unknowable forces. They are memes, symbols, metaphors, even deities. Their supposed weaknesses arise not from textual evidence, but from cultural reinterpretation. The unknowable becomes representational. Nowhere is this more visible than in ironic fandom. The cult of Cthulhu as an internet joke. Why vote for the lesser evil? Treats the being not as an entity, but as a symbol of total apathy. Plush toys, stickers, and satire frames Lovecraft's most iconic creature as something vaguely malevolent, but mostly harmless. In these portrayals, Cthulhu is lazy, disgruntled, occasionally cranky. Weakness becomes punchline, the god who sleeps, snores, or forgets to wake. The terror of indifference is reinterpreted as cosmic procrastination. This is not satire aimed at Lovecraft. It is defense. Making Cthulhu absurd is a way to reclaim psychic space. We must pause here to consider parody as ritual. Subcultures often defang fear by recoding it. The satanic panic of the 1980s, for example, led to the emergence of playful Satanism as cultural resistance. A similar process has occurred with the mythos. Fans quote the Necronomicon in mock seriousness. Discord servers host elder god summoning nights as themed events. These are not attempts to access the divine. They are social inversions, communal rituals that use the trappings of horror to produce bonding through absurdity. Academic communities have approached the mythos differently. Scholars of literature, philosophy, and cultural studies treat Lovecraft as a site of epistemic anxiety. In trauma studies, the unreadable gods mirror the postmodern subject's inability to locate meaning after rupture. In posthumanist theory, entities like Azathoth symbolize the decentering of the human from cosmology. Scholars do not laugh at the monsters. They study their implications. But even here, a kind of weakness is introduced, not in the gods, but in how they are framed. Metaphor replaces mystery. The beings are no longer actors, but concepts. Consider this carefully every time a scholar equates Nyarlathotep with capitalism or Yog-Sothoth with networked consciousness. They reduce the god to a framework. This is not misuse. It is methodology, but it marks a shift from dread to analysis. Cosmic horror becomes a discourse, one that can be dissected, cited, and archived. The ineffable becomes a case study. The horror becomes legible. Occult communities offer yet another transformation. Some modern esoteric groups have incorporated Lovecraftian elements into ritual practice. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, blurred lines between fictional grimoire and usable text. Though widely regarded as a hoax or literary stunt, it gained traction among practitioners of chaos magic, who saw mythic coherence as unnecessary. If belief is structure, they argued, then even fictional gods can be summoned, because ritual acts upon mind, not on reality. This introduces a fascinating inversion. Lovecraft's gods, designed to be unreachable, become reachable through fiction. Their weakness is not physical. It is symbolic susceptibility. Once something is imagined, it can be invoked, not as truth, but as pattern. And once it becomes pattern, it becomes malleable. The triadic progression here is striking. Fandom makes the gods absurd, scholarship makes them abstract, and esotericism makes them actionable. In all three, the original inaccessibility is reduced. Not because the texts changed, but because the context did. The gods remain unchanged, but the frameworks we use to engage with them render them increasingly approachable. What remains unclear is whether this accessibility weakens the mythos or strengthens it. Perhaps the most Lovecraftian outcome is not that the gods are made into jokes or theories, but that they remain untouched despite those efforts. They absorb parody, critique, and ritual and persist. They do not care what we call them. They never did. As we reach the final section, we must consider what all of this reveals about the human mind. Why do we continually seek structure in forces designed to deny it? What does it say about us that we assign weakness where there is only non-recognition? The final turn is not outward toward the gods, but inward toward the psychological and philosophical implications of believing there is any confrontation at all. At the heart of cosmic horror lies a quiet psychological violence. It whispers that meaning is arbitrary, that human cognition is structurally inadequate, and that knowledge, not ignorance, is what ruins us. Lovecraft's gods endure not because they are omnipotent, but because they are irrelevant to our categories of understanding, and yet we persist in assigning them weaknesses. This tendency is not merely interpretive, it is psychological. It reveals more about us than about the beings themselves. The human mind is a meaning-making engine. We seek pattern, causality, and closure, three things cosmic horror denies. When a story ends with a retreat, we label it a victory. When a ritual misfires, we call it containment. These are not accurate readings. They are epistemic defense mechanisms. Without them, the universe becomes intolerable. We cannot dwell indefinitely in the open-ended, so we close the loop ourselves, even when the text resists it. This is why the idea of a god's pathetic weakness persists. It offers psychological leverage. If Cthulhu can be repelled by a ship, we reassert causality. If Yog-Sothoth can be banished with a chant, we reaffirm agency. These illusions soothe us. They imply that the incomprehensible can be named, met, and perhaps, eventually, understood. In this sense, the imagined weakness is not a failure of the god. It is a failure of the reader's will to remain uncertain. We must pause, here to consider what this reveals about the nature of horror itself. Traditional horror evokes fear through confrontation, of death, punishment, monstrosity. Cosmic horror evokes fear through displacement. The threat is not that something is coming for you. It is that you were never part of the equation. You do not belong, and never did. To believe in weakness is to smuggle yourself back into relevance. Philosophically, this intersects with deep ontological discomfort. Cosmic horror shares terrain with existentialism, nihilism, and antinatalism. It aligns with thinkers like Schopenhauer and Ligotti, who see consciousness as a curse. In this framework, the gods are not villains. They are metaphors for a universe without center. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, does not hate you. He does not know you exist. That is the horror. And the human reaction is telling. We assign him a flaw to make him more like us. Knowable, vulnerable, bound. But what if the only real weakness in these stories is the human compulsion to interpret? What if every act of naming, narrating, and theorizing is itself the breach? Consider the scholars who go mad not from seeing the god, but from glimpsing the frame beyond which nothing holds. In this light, the greatest threat is not the monster, but the awareness that no monster is necessary. The abyss is empty, and still the mind breaks. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror's endurance lies in its refusal to resolve. The stories do not end. They unfinish. The gods remain. The stars shift. The reader is left with implications, not answers. This is what makes the mythos psychologically infectious. Once encountered, it cannot be unthought. It lingers precisely because it offers no closure, only re-encounter through new frames, joke, game, theory, citing, and so we arrive at the final implication. The pathetic weakness of Lovecraftian monsters is not theirs. It is ours. It is the projection of our need for narrative, stability, moral resolution, and epistemic closure. The gods do not yield, we yield, to comfort, to metaphor, to pattern. They remain unchanged. We rewrite them again and again so that we can sleep. But what if the dream is theirs? What if we were only ever the metaphor